From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
Do the best leaders seek cooperation and compromise, or do they stand firm and seek to defeat those with different ideas? Is moving to the middle a sign of weakness and betrayal, or simply a practical and sensible way to solve problems and get things done? A new book by two Kansas scholars examines the past tradition of bipartisanship that for many decades influenced the Kansas governor's office. They contrast that with the Brownback era of staunch conservatism and its often inflexible ideology that resisted compromise and some say stifled progress. Join us as we consider the best way forward for Kansas in a nation that is more economically competitive and socially diverse than ever. What impact does a governor's ideological approach have on our success or failure as a state? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Hello and welcome to Kansas Week. I'm Jared Cerullo. Fascinating topic. We're going to have a roundtable discussion this week. I'm pleased to welcome two authors of Reform and Reaction, The Arc of Kansas Politics. They are Wichita State University Professor Emeritus Ed Flingy and Emporia State University Political Science Professor Michael Smith. We've also invited Cake News senior political reporter Pilar Pedraza and Wichita City Councilman Dalton Glasscock to be part of the discussion. I'll start with the two professors. Fascinating book. Professor Flingy, what brought this book about? How did this get started? It's been a long process, right?
Well, it has been about 10 years of incubation, actually. It started with Burdett Loomis suggesting to a group of writers who were doing columns on state politics and state public policy. And we'd been doing that for a few years, and he said, we need to do a book on Kansas politics that covers not just current events, but a significant period of time, almost covering the post-war period to the present. And so he spearheaded that project, recruited a publisher, did an initial outline of chapters, did assignments. And what we ended up with is Reform and Reaction. And I happened to be assigned some of the more historical pieces, which covered Governors Bennett, Carlin, Hayden, Finney, and Brownback. And we looked at the connection between political leadership and public policy. And as your intro indicated, building bipartisan coalitions were a part of that reform era. They set foundational public policy that is in place today and influencing how the state functions. In fact, we had an earlier discussion about governmental ethics and the showing wearing political activity into the bowling booth. That was actually done in the Bennett era. Robert Bennett was instrumental in the governmental ethics reform of 1974 and 5.
So, Professor Smith, how did you get involved with this project?
It was a group of people called Insight Kansas. They're Kansas professors who write newspaper columns carried around the state, including here in Wichita, giving our input on different things going on at the state level and state politics. I was not one of the founding members. I believe Ed was, but I was invited to join by another one of the co-authors of the book, Chap Rackaway, in 2012. And at one point, Burdett Loomis, who was a very well-known professor from KU, got us all together and said, you know, there haven't really been any books about the modern era in Kansas politics. In the past 15 years, there have actually only been 3 books about Kansas politics, and Ed and I respectively are the co-authors of each of the other ones. A book like this, there hasn't been one since 1991.
My goodness.
So it was time, and we got together and collaborated, and here it is.
So the book starts talking about Kansas politics from about the 1950s in Topeka state governing, and one of the things that I thought was very interesting is it talks about a shift where rural politicians had most of the control of what happened in Topeka. When did that start to change, and why?
Well, of all things, our friend, the late Burdett Loomis, he passed while the book was being written. It's dedicated to him. He wrote that chapter. And you're absolutely right. Back in the day, we didn't have one person, one vote. And in fact, the rural counties were way overrepresented in both chambers of the state legislature. In the state house, every county got its own state rep. And some counties in western Kansas only have a few thousand people. And then you had these Supreme Court rulings on one person, one vote that were revolutionary. And the Kansas legislature came together, and some of the leaders who led this redistricting process were literally drawing themselves out of their own districts. They were ending their political careers, at least as they knew them, but they had this sense of public service that what was best for the state came first. And it, of course, made representation much more urban, because Kansas, even in the 60s, was a much more urban state than many people believe, and that's only continued through today.
Sure. And Pilar, we've seen, of course, Kansas, the western part of the state, is much different than the eastern part of the state. Their issues are much different than the eastern part of the state. How do we gel that all together in Topeka in the State House?
Well, I would answer that right now. We really don't do a very good job of that. At best, they have this phrase at the State House called Johnson County candy.
Ah.
And what it is basically, okay, we'll give our Johnson County colleagues a little something sweet so they'll vote for our Western Kansas policies. And that's how it works right now. It's, you know, less appealing term for it from the federal level would be pork barreling. And that's really the only way that they're making those two sides work together at the moment. It's honestly the main form of compromise that I see. I mean, we talk a lot about how the legislature votes together more than it votes separately. 95+% of the time, I think it may even be as high as 98% of the time sometimes, they vote almost unanimously on issues. Across the aisle, no issues there. So we're still seeing remnants of that bipartisanship. It's those big ticket items, shall we say, the controversial terms where we start to see the party split happening and that more Washington style of politics at the Kansas level.
Yeah. Councilman Glasscock, dive in here. What do you think? I mean, we've seen, like I mentioned, issues for Western Kansas quite different than issues for Wichita and Johnson County. As a councilman of one of the largest cities in the state, obviously, you don't have to think about water a lot of, well, we do have to think about water now. But, you know, the issues are different, it seems like sometimes.
Well, if Western Kansas thrives, the rest of the state thrives. And if Western Kansas doesn't, then Wichita doesn't as well. And so we have to work together with our colleagues from the West and our colleagues from Johnson County to make sure we can get things done. I don't know the exact year, but Kansas hasn't elected a governor from Wichita since around the 1930s, and elected a senator from this area as well. And so Wichita has to lean on our partners across the state to make sure that what is good for them is also good for the big city as well.
Yeah. Professor Flingy, one of the things that I thought was interesting as well was the book talks about how state governing in Kansas should be austere but adequate. What does that mean?
Well, that was a Robert Docking term and carried out by his budget director. And it was keep things to the basics in terms of state policy. And it rang a bell with Kansans. They embraced that. So it was a term that was quite prevalent when I was first in state government.
Are we still like that today, or is it much different?
Well, I don't think it really was a dimension of the reform era. The reform era did foundational public policy that related to ethics reform, reforming the state legislature, the governorship, the judiciary, and back to the basics was not a part of that development.
Yeah. And, you know, Professor Smith, talk about austere but adequate a little bit more. What does that mean in terms of the everyday person on the street?
Well, a lot of it was really a bipartisan moderate politics. Kansas does not elect Democrats, for example, to the U.S. Senate. Hasn't had one since 1932. Hasn't voted for a Democrat for president since 1964. But Kansas has had nearly as many Democratic governors in modern times as it has Republicans, including the current governor, Laura Kelly. And it's this kind of middle-of-the-road politics where things like education need to be funded. A lot of the backlash against Brownback was because he cut funding for education. And Kansans want small government, but they don't want it that small. They're very protective of their public schools. And so it's this centrist politics that is wary of the extremists on both sides, that doesn't want government to do everything, doesn't want government to solve all their problems for them, but the things that government does should be done well. Funding public schools, updating the state constitution, which Ed writes about in his chapters, conducting elections, which is done relatively well in Kansas, by the way. Government, what it does do ought to be done well, and I think Kansans get it, that's going to take some tax revenue. And so it's this distrust of the two extremes and this idea that the fundamentals need to be taken care of even if we have to pay some taxes.
And we saw in this most recent governor's campaign with Laura Kelly, she campaigned very hardly on a middle-of-the-road type campaign. So when you talk about those extremes, it seems like she was trying to avoid that.
Yeah, exactly. She ran a TV commercial where she was literally standing in the middle of the road. I'll never forget that. But she is kind of a throwback in a way to an earlier era in Kansas politics. Ed handled a lot of the reform in his part of the book, and my colleagues Patrick Miller, Chapman Rackaway, and I handled a lot of the reaction. And the reaction, of course, is this modern day, this culture war, the hot button issue politics, whether it's abortion rights, trans kids, guns, things like that. And those things are important to a lot of Kansans, but it pushes against this austere but adequate tradition that says, look, at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that our government is functioning.
Yeah. And Pilar, you know, Professor Smith mentioned a little bit about Kansas politics. Kansas has always been considered a red state, a Republican state. I don't think the electorate has elected or gone for a Democratic presidential candidate for a long, long time. But we elect Democrat governors every few years. Why is that? How does that happen?
Well, why Democrat governors? It comes down to education, which is not an issue that plays a role in Senate and congressional races, not an issue that plays a role in federal races. But it is very much an issue that plays a role in state races. It's part of why we saw in, I believe it was 2014, 2016, we saw a turnover from a conservative majority to a moderate majority in the Republican Party at the State House. And then the moderates, because the moderate Republicans really are the ones who have historically controlled the State House. If they go with the Democrats on an issue, then the Democrat issue wins. If they go with the conservative Republicans, then the conservative Republican issue wins. But what we've seen is a couple of issues over the last few decades, from my perspective. One, we've seen Washington-style politics trickling down, those hot button issues that you're talking about, Michael, coming down into the system, and people developing a fanatical attachment to their political party, to the point where we have more people now who are voting straight ticket, that whether there's an R or a D or an L, but specifically R and D next to the candidate's name, if you ask them on the specific issues, where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on this? And then you compare their responses to where the candidates stand, or even more important, where they voted historically, it is very often different from the way they actually vote, because they're voting based on party, not based on individual candidate stances. And that is a major change that we're seeing.
Councilman Glasscock, do you agree with that? You've been chair of the Sedgwick County Republican Party before in the past. Do you agree with that?
I do, and as chair, we try to find bipartisan ways to work with the Sedgwick County Democrat Party when I was in leadership. Now, I know that I'm not faultless in this as well. Sometimes you get caught up in the emotions, sometimes you get caught up in the politics of things, but you always have to recenter yourself that Kansans like bipartisan leadership. Kansans just want to get things done, and they don't want the drama associated with it as well. I mean, the professor had mentioned Bob Dole in the ADA. Kansas has led on seismic legislation at the federal level, and every piece of meaningful legislation that stays through history is bipartisanly done. If you want something to last, it needs to be bipartisan, because it ebbs and flows in politics, especially at the national level, but here in Kansas as well.
Yeah. And is that moving to the middle a sign of weakness, though, when we talk about issues? We had an abortion issue in Kansas here just a couple of years ago, and that didn't go how Republicans wanted it to go. So is moving to the middle, is that a sign of weakness?
Well, I think it's a sign of strength. And it was critical in foundational public policy over the reform era. Whether you're talking about Bennett and a reform governorship, or Carlin, economic development, property tax reform, Hayden, infrastructure, and then during the Finney years, the legislature moved forward. Fred Kerr and Barkus led in foundational education policy. So all of those, though, folks moved to the middle, and it's a strength of Kansas politics.
Good. I would be amiss if we didn't talk about the Sam Brownback years in Kansas governing. Professor Smith, how did the Sam Brownback years change the state of Kansas? For the better or for the worse, or what?
Depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
But, you know, most people might be surprised to hear this, but Sam Brownback was probably the first truly conservative governor Kansas ever had. Kansas has had plenty of Republican governors and more Democrats than you might think, but they've almost always been moderates. And there was also the populist era, but that's going way back. The true kind of modern day culture warrior conservative, Brownback was the first. Bill Graves and Mike Hayden, for example, were pro-choice. They didn't necessarily talk about it a lot, but they were. Joan Finney, who was a Democrat, was anti-abortion. But Sam Brownback brought Kansas into the modern era, for better or for worse, putting those culture war issues front and center. Certainly a conservative Christian, talked a lot about the traditional family structure, encouraging marriage. I was never completely clear on how he planned to do that, but he definitely wanted to do it. But then, of course, most of all, he became identified with this tax cut. And we write quite a bit about that in the book, that the tax cut kind of happened in a funny way. A bill had passed the House, and the Senate agreed to it, thinking that they would go into negotiations. And then the House passed the Senate version, which normally doesn't happen. So it was sort of like this surprise tax cut. Some of the senators were not happy. And then Brownback owned it and pledged to phase out the state's income tax. So it happened in this sort of messy way that politics does. He didn't necessarily come to office on that campaign promise, but it is hung on him, and that will be his legacy. And of course, the promise of economic growth never really materialized. If you look at neighboring states that did not cut taxes or did not cut taxes as much, Missouri, Oklahoma, Nebraska, they had about the same levels of economic growth as Kansas did. And instead, there were these revenue shortfalls. And they ended up, for example, turning to the Highway Trust Fund, nicknamed the Bank of KDOT,
Right.
And pulling money out of there, which that's not what that's supposed to be used for. And also, though, what really got Brownback politically, I think, was when he did try to do away with the school-based state aid formula and lost midterm elections, and the next year the legislature brought it back.
Yeah. Pilar, how do you think the Brownback era affected the state of Kansas?
I'm going to actually step one step back there.
Sure.
We talked about him being the first truly conservative governor of Kansas. I talked to a lot of people who were very surprised by some of his conservative policies. A lot of, just Kansans on the streets. They weren't expecting that after his time in the Senate. They saw him as more of, he was very successful in the U.S. Senate and did a lot of work across the aisle. They saw him as more of the moderate type Republican that they were used to having as a governor. And so the conservative policies he started espousing, for a lot of folks that I spoke with, they were kind of surprised about that. And of course, then once it started affecting their schools,
Yes.
they were done with it.
Right.
But very much, we've talked about how education is really one of the big core issues of why Kansas governors have been so moderate throughout the years. And I do believe that attack on education, whether you want to consider it an attack or not, the cuts on education. Sorry, I was on the other side of I was in the classroom at the time teaching, so it felt rather personal at the time. But the cuts on education were something that parents and, if you don't have kids, your nieces, your nephews, your friends' kids, your siblings, whatever. We all have kids somewhere in our lives, and we all want them to have a good chance at life, and we all know that really starts with a good education.
Yeah. And as Councilman, as the Brownback years, you're still pretty young, obviously, but when the Brownback years, did you get to vote for Sam Brownback, and how do you think his policies affected the state?
I was not eligible to vote
Yeah.
during that election, which is crazy actually to think about. But I think Pilar brings up a very interesting point, is there's a big difference between executive leadership and legislative leadership. And sometimes legislative leadership doesn't translate to the executive branch and vice versa. And so in my role in the council, we act as a legislative body, which is very different than an executive role. And sometimes those things don't translate when people step into new leadership roles.
Yeah, yeah. And professors, either one of you can handle this question, but what are those big ticket items? Kansas has always been a farming state,
Sure.
Especially since the 1880s when we were an early state. What are those items that are always going to be at the forefront of Kansas politics?
I'll take one and then let Ed have his say. One of them that doesn't get nearly enough coverage is water. As the High Plains Aquifer drains, how is Western Kansas going to sustain itself? And that was a problem before climate change started accelerating. Now it's worse. And there has been movement in various parts of the state, some more progressive than others in terms of managing that aquifer. Now we're starting to see it in the cities. You're having it in Wichita. We've got drought all over the state. The vast majority of water in this state, we don't drink it, it goes to agriculture. And that is not the bulk of Kansas's economy anymore, but it's crucial, especially to the rural communities. And if the rural communities can't self-sustain, they become dependent on transfers from the urban communities. So it's in everybody's interests. And there needs to be a water management plan. But again, once some hot button issue comes up like trans athletes, it pushes that right off the agenda.
But
and that's unfortunate.
There has always been a fight between rural Western Kansas and suburban
without
about
a doubt.
water.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some other hot button
there's a
topics
long
that have
time
always...
Wichita fight over
Yeah.
water, just putting wells down in the aquifers and Cheney Reservoir. Those were huge issues in the past. But education is always going to be an issue, and how you balance smaller rural schools with urban schools like Wichita. And
And the book talked a little bit about how in the 1950s, there were more than 2,000 different school districts across the state, if I remember that correctly?
believe it or not, there were 9,000
Oh my gosh.
if you go back far enough. But yeah, educational reform has been ongoing. And we spent some time talking about the foundation plan set in the early 90s. So, but finance issues are always front and center, whether it's austere but adequate or trying to eliminate the state income tax, which Brownback was trying to do and obviously failed. But infrastructure issue, roads, critical role of state government. So
Have the issues changed much since the 1950s rather than today?
I think the cultural issues have taken a lot of the air out of the room in state. One thing about the reform era is you had folks take public policy making seriously. They put their careers on the line in some cases. They built bipartisan coalitions and established foundational policies that last for many years.
Yeah. All right. With about 30 seconds left, Pilar, I've noticed one other interesting thing is that we seem to see, Republicans have had a supermajority in both houses now, and that seems to be going even farther that way now.
Yeah, and this comes back to what we talked about, folks voting R or D as opposed to voting on individual candidate stances and voting histories. If you ask folks in Johnson County who have Republican representatives, they would say education is very important to them, and yet their representatives have voted time and again against what the education community thinks is best.
All right. The book is Reform and Reaction, The Arc of Kansas Politics. How can people get it?
It's the University Press of Kansas, popular online bookstores, but also your local bookstores, including your independent bookstores, will have it. But you can also order it directly from the University Press of Kansas.
All right. Fascinating discussion. That's all the time we have this week. Go get the book. I'm Jared Cerullo. Have a great week.